The woods kept time. The first tap came, while Evan Lark was rinsing a mug with hose water behind his rental on the edge of the woods, the rubber hose slipping in his palm as the stream stuttered and glittered in late afternoon sun. He turned off the spigot, and the water died to a string, then to nothing. The mug, chipped near the rim, held a hairline crack shaped like a fishbone. He wiped it with a towel left to dry on the rail and felt grit in the fibers, like sand that wouldn't shake loose. The tapping continued, not the hollow tick of cooling metal or a neighbor's hammer, but something smaller and steadier. Tap, 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 a metronome lost somewhere in the trees. He stood with the towel still in his hand and listened. It was early September, and the woods held their breath between summer and fall. The light bent through the cedars behind his yard, and in it he saw dust and gnats moving like a scattered alphabet, trying to agree on a word. He told himself it was a woodpecker. There were always woodpeckers. They were part of the place, like the fridge hum that took on a personality at night, or the uneven beep of the barcode scanner at the market where he worked. He told himself it was background. The mug left a wet ring on the rail, and the towel left another wider one. Something in those circles reminded him of the coin he kept in his pocket, a smooth nickel he de-rubbed nearly flat over 3 years of nervous appointments and waits. He put the mug on the inside ledge of the window rather than bring it in. He'd wash it properly later, with soap hot enough to chase the oily film that hose water left on the lip. The taps were still going. He imagined a small red head flicking from side to side, a child's toy. "Go on," he said to nothing, not meaning the bird so much as whatever part of him had stopped moving to listen. That night, after the store closed, he vacuumed under the produce bins while the compressors in the back clicked and woke, clicked and slept. The manager, a man named Whit, who seemed permanently sealed inside a vest too tight for his belly, had been hovering all evening and now stood in the doorway to the back with his hands on his hips. "We'll need to put out the signs by 6, Whit said, as if Evan had been unaware of the hour for 10 years. "What signs?" "Trail advisory." Whit tapped his fingernail on the door jamb and tilted his head toward the newspaper stacked in blue bundles by the office. "County's got a thing in the morning edition, avian, some phenomenon. They want folks to give the woods a rest while they figure it out." "Figure what out?" Evan asked, though he knew. Birds dying. He'd seen a jay in the parking lot that afternoon, its wings folded carefully as in a nap, its eye like a glossy seed. Whit shrugged. One of the compressors in back kicked on with a sound like a sigh through teeth. The fluorescent tubes buzzed above them. Everything in the market had a noise, and the noises together made a blanket you didn't notice until you tried to think. "Just do the signs," Whit said, and when he turned the movement of his shoulder through a cold waft of cologne that didn't belong in a store that sold onions and bleach. The scanner at Register 3 hesitated whenever Evan ran a jar of pickles over it, and the beep in that lane sounded sharp in a way that made him fidget. He taped a paper over its mouth with a handwritten note that said, "Use Reg 2." The note was crooked, his R like a broken fence post, and he pulled it off and rewrote it more neatly. When he closed up, the parking lot lights cast cones that trembled with moths. Beyond the fence, the woods were simply a shape. He stood a moment at the back door, his key warm in his fingers, and noticed a pattern that felt like the echo of something that had happened earlier or years ago. The taps he'd heard behind his house gathered into an aftertaste at the back of his mind, the way he could sometimes still feel the pressure of a brace no longer there. On the drive home, he stopped at the single traffic light in Loudon S Center, a suspended lantern that seemed to weigh the night as it swung. The light had a habit of turning yellow for no one at 2 in the morning. It went to red now, though there were no headlights for miles in any direction, and he sat with his foot on the brake and watched the empty intersection gripped in red. In the cab, his breath cleared a space on the window that slowly fogged again. Somewhere in that minute alone at the light, He waited for the taps to begin. He told himself this was harmless, a game of attention, a thought coiling itself around a twig. But the taps did come, close and not close, in the tires or in the trees or in his skull. He couldn't tell. He drove on when the light turned green, because that's what the light wanted. The things he noticed, the beeps and hums and empty red, the towel roughness that persisted even after 3 washings, did not yet add up to anything. They were details of place, the way his hallway held a coolness that remembered the old woman who had lived there before him and who had kept the curtains nailed back with thumbtacks. He had kept the tacks because he liked what they made the fabric do, the slight puckering, the coiled remainder of one person's habit in another's day. He searched in a drawer for an aspirin and found a receipt from the hardware, days old. The numbers on it made a trail of prices, like someone counting in a language he didn't know. He smoothed the paper and felt the heat from his fingers wake it. He threw it out and then took it back from the trash because the date needed to be double-checked. He was sure a week had passed faster than it should. He slept, and the tapping folded itself into the night. House noises, until even his dreams were busy with it. He dreamed the tap coming from under a floorboard, a pipe weeping against a joist. When he woke, the fridge was humming in a tone that trailed him to the sink. He froze at the faucet and watched the water push the last of the night down the drain. In the morning, Loudon's weekly paper ran a photo of a sheriff standing at the mouth of a trail, his boots blades in the flattened grass. The headline spoke in the mild grammar of advisory, out of an abundance of caution. The paper liked that phrase the way it liked wary optimism and community effort. The store put the signs in the window, and Whit walked through with his clipboard in a way that suggested if signs broke bad, he would have to make the hard call. People bought batteries and extra rolls of paper towels. They bought plastic jugs of water, though no one had said anything about water. At the donut case, an old man with a wide plaid shirt told the woman next to him that the woodpeckers were counting down. Counting down to what? She asked, not in alarm, but the flat way locals raised curiosity without committing to it. You know, the man said. He tapped the glass case with a knuckle. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The donuts wore sugar like frost. Evan bagged onions and listened. When he looked toward the produce door, the swinging ones with round windows like portholes, the metal hinge gave 3 quick clicks as they went. He began to move through the day, as if avoiding a line drawn on the floor. When a pallet jack squealed, he felt it at the bridge of his nose. When the scanner beeped for a loaf of white bread, he baselined the beep against a sound in his head to see if they matched. He ate a sandwich in the back and found he had no appetite for the second half, though he didn't know why. He set it on top of the case of apples and covered it with a napkin for later that he knew would not come. At home that night, the woods had sharpened. This was a trick of dark, and what it did to edges he knew, but the trees seemed made of a more insisting dark than the air around them, a velvet with shape to it. He stood on his step and heard the thing again. The small, severe, relentless tap, tap, tap. Even mosquitoes do not keep such perfect time. Okay, he said, less to make a sound than to pin himself inside of one, like a thumb under a thread knot. He wrote the times when he heard the tapping. He wrote them on a folded-up paper takeout menu with a pen that stopped working and then started again as if it needed to be convinced. 7:42 p.m., 9:03 p.m., 1:10 a.m. The numbers made an odd comfort. He believed vaguely that the pattern would show something ordinary. He wanted to prove it was simply a bird moving from tree to tree, the rhythm of daily living. The small clock on the stove flicked to 1:11 and kept going. When his pen finally gave up, he put the menu in a drawer full of chords that used to belong to something and now were only chords. Sleep thinned over him in patched layers. He woke from time to time and checked the ceiling. He felt the small pricks at the edge of his scalp where hair grew too quick and uneven. He went to the bathroom and noticed the water line in the toilet was a finger width lower than it had been. The porcelain ring revealed pale against the rest of the bowl. He chalked this up to a glitch in the well, or air trapped in the line, or a neighbor running a sprinkler with no good reason in the middle of the night. In the mirror, his face was the face he always had, but a notch had appeared underneath his right eye, a place where tiredness turned the skin a grayish yellow. He pressed the notch with a fingertip, felt the bones behind give their patient reply. His head did not hurt, not exactly. It was an alertness with nowhere to go. 3 days put distance between him and the man he'd been the week before, and he could not say why. The paper talked about songbirds falling out of trees in the forest's northern tract. The paper talked about experts at the state lab using provisional language. The paper said small numbers and cautioned that correlation was not causation and that panic is never useful. The paper's tone was a mixture of going to church and changing a tire. Evan wiped down the black conveyor belt at Register 2 with a cloth that smelled of lemon and something bitter. The fluorescent buzz developed a stutter near the mop closet, and every time he walked past, he looked up and the tube flickered and then settled into itself as if it had been pretending. A woman came in and bought a cart full of bottled water, and her credit card made the little scraping sound on the counter that woke Evan's teeth. She said, "Have you heard it?" Not unkindly, but with a tiny secret excitement. When he did not answer, she smiled and plucked at the collar of her sweater. "I love it here," she said, and in the way she said love was the word temporary, the way people with second homes say it about the places they bring their kayaks. He nodded because he did not have the energy to narrate the place to her in a way that would match what she needed to hear. He bagged, he counted the bills in the drawer, he taped a piece of paper over a chip in the tile so no one would catch a heel. A tap came from somewhere behind the office wall at the rate of a slow heartbeat. By the end of the week, he knew which shelves made what sound. The cereal aisle made a soft hiss at its leftmost end, something about air from a vent that was never quite reattached right. The freezer where the ice cream lived coughed when it started, like a person trying to pretend he wasn't ill. The roll-up door to the loading dock made a sound like scraping an old pan when its chain clanked through the track. Each sound had a place in him now, and the wood taps in the woods were one more place. He kept an inventory without trying to, the way a nervous tongue seeks a crack in a tooth again and again to be sure the crack is not growing even as it grows. He stopped boiling water in the mornings because the kettle whistled too close to the pitch the scanner made. He drank hose water because it tasted of zinc and leaves and did not have to hiss through the whistle to get to him. He told himself this was simpler, a way to be the kind of man who could live alone and not mind the squeaks and ticks of things. He stopped listening to the radio because the staticky places between stations sounded like someone breathing through cloth. He piled receipts on the table and weighed them down with his mug, and the circle they made under the mug was a nest he could pretend was warm. People said the woodpeckers were warnings. People said a year like this always had a sign. And if the sign wasn't the woodpeckers, it would be the streetlight that blinked out and then back in on Elm 4 times a minute, or the stop sign on Bell Road that now turned slowly on its pole, so that some mornings it told no one anything. People said the bird eyes were wrong, and that when you looked at them, you felt as if the seeing went the other direction. There were other stories, older ones, but telling older ones made you sound like you wanted to be seen telling them. And people here cared how they sounded more than they cared about the end of the world. He folded a towel while the dryer ran and noticed it was uneven along one edge. He refolded it. The dryer thumped once in the cycle like it always had, but the thump now belonged to the tap in the trees. The way a pair of songs played in separate rooms can fall into step whether they mean to or not. The county closed the trailheads by the weekend. Bright tape, paper warnings in plastic sleeves that blued with dew. A deputy, the taller one with the soft mouth, drove up and down the roads by the woods and honked at vehicles parked on the shoulder. A boy who worked the deli left a note on the staff board that said he'd be down by the river if anyone needed him, and drew a little fish in the corner, and the manager circled the note with a blue pen and wrote, "See me." The church put a sandwich board out front that said prayer service tonight, and the A on the board was tipping over. The laundromat in the strip beyond the highway had one machine that accepted quarters and then stopped, and the owner had hung a sign on it that said, "Out." The groceries cooler regurgitated a smell of milk and rubber. Everything felt like the end of something, though no one could say what. Evan avoided sleep for a night without deciding to. He moved from chair to sink and back, as if he were bailing a boat no one else could see leaking. He sat on the floor by the back door with his ear near the threshold. He told himself it couldn't be one bird. How could it be one bird that traveled from tree to tree without rest? He told himself it was several birds over the course of hours, or a branch tapping in wind. He told himself wind does many things that sound like woodpeckers. Each telling had to be constructed from scratch. None of them stayed up long by themselves. He found an old pair of earplugs from the box he used when mowing the lawn. He rolled them tight and inserted them, and held them there while they expanded. He felt the pressure build inside his ear canals in a way that made him think of boats entering a lock. The water leveling to home things. The plugs turned the sounds into pressure without shape. The kitchen clock still told time. The fridge still hummed. The taps still arrived. He took the plugs out and put them on the counter by the stove, where they left yellow dust. The body will find its own way to say what may not be said outright. His appetite went narrow, his stomach not exactly nauseated, but skeptical. He halved breakfast and then threw away 3 forkfuls because they had gone cold and because they suddenly seemed an unreasonable quantity. Sleep came too light. When it came, it did not cover all parts. He began to misplace small things, a key, a pen, the receipt for the oil change, and found them not in other rooms, but in the pocket of his jacket, in the glove compartment, in the freezer, like a joke. He laughed once alone in the kitchen and heard the laugh ring in a way that felt artificial. He did not try that again. He considered going to the doctor to ask about sounds a person could hear even when the house did not. He pictured the doctor's office, the aquarium, with a single anemic fish near the sticks of a plastic castle. He pictured the forms and the round lettered questions that didn't yet allow for correct answers. How often do you feel nervous? Often, but not that kind. The waiting room chairs would squeak. The blood pressure cuff would kiss and then tighten. He thought of the blood pressure machine in aisle 1 by the pharmacy that printed out receipts with blocky numbers. He thought of the woman who had said she loved it here. He didn't go. A rumor moved through Loudon that a hiker had found a woodpecker on the ground, its head cocked to a wrong angle, and its beak still pecking the dirt in small pecks, each a sentence comprised entirely of periods. A man elsewise known for being careful with his words told this with the seriousness that people cut and fit for news of death. A boy filmed a tree that had hundreds of tiny holes in a spiral upward pattern like the marks left by a drill in soft wood. He posted it somewhere on the internet and said the words you always say when you want something to count: weird, creepy, omen. Someone else looked closely at a black and white photograph posted on a community page and said the bird SI had no light in it, that it was like the lenses used for a defunct 3D craze, flat and reflecting the wrong thing. Evan pulled the towel out of the dryer and shook it, and the towel, which had never had much to say, now argued against being folded. He stretched it out on the bed and smoothed the edges. He had been doing little things with his hands to keep them from tapping. He had not allowed his fingers to rest on any surface for fear they would begin a tune. He had not allowed his nails to meet one another. He felt sometimes like a man walking beside a cliff, talking himself into not noticing the drop. Whit handed around a typed memo with the county seal in the corner. The memo said that trail access would be restricted from dusk to dawn, and that during daylight hours, small groups would be escorted at a distance by volunteers with radios to record anything that seemed unusual. The memo said the word surveillance in a way that made people read it twice. The memo said to report. Evan took his copy home and left it on the table. He sat down beside it and watched the condensation from his water glass make the paper curl. The fridge kicked and the compressor's voice sounded tired. He wished for a silence he could not name the shape of. He wanted the ending of a thing, not because endings are good, but because they are in a way fair. That night the tapping seemed to come from within the walls. He put his ear to the plaster and felt his own pulse as a throb in his jaw. He breathed slowly and counted. The taps moved through him and seemed to locate themselves behind his right eye, back in the meat and bone. Somewhere under the place a child would hold against a car window on a long trip. He felt a pressure there like the settle of weather before a storm. It wasn't pain. It was closer to memory. He breathed with it and remembered a day, long ago, at a kitchen table that smelled of tomatoes and dirt, a woman scraping her spoon once, twice, leaving a ring in the pot. He had not thought of that scrape in 20 years. The tap at his eye held steady, as if it were training him to receive something. At dawn, he went out with the idea of work. He took his clippers and a bucket and took the path behind the rental up to the low break in the trees, where the ground leveled. He wore his old boots, the ones that made him walk cautiously, because the left heel had a way of slipping on wet stone. He did not tell Whit or anyone he would be in the woods, because he was not formally going in, and because he believed things you did not announce could air out and be harmless. The woods received him the way the woods receive anyone, with a strictness he could respect. The air smelled like iron and yellow leaves. He stood for a while and waited for the idea of turning back to feel like relief. The idea did not feel like relief. It felt like an excuse not to understand something he had already allowed inside. The signs the county had posted down at the proper lot were not here. Here, there was only the quiet tension of many small living things choosing when to move. The tap came from farther in, not constant now, but something with drift, a sound that no longer asked to be proved. He walked. The ground, dry at the top, grew spongy as he went, and he had to place each foot where the moss would let it. He thought once of a time years before when he had walked into a field to retrieve an old kite, and the field had been seeded with burrs that stuck to him in a way he had not anticipated, burrs that took his socks and categorized them as pasture rather than clothing. This felt like that, the place deciding what part of him it would own. He knew the names of some trees the way you know the names of cousins you saw at weddings: cedar, maple, beech. He could not have said which was which if asked by anyone who would correct him, but he knew enough to say, the red one, the pleasant one, the one that holds dampness. He passed a stump that had held rain for years in a bowl, and now bred black water that would not evaporate. He passed a fallen tree, whose base had turned into shelf fungus, stacked like plates in a cabinet. He had done no more than this, walked into the trees he lived beside, but the morning took that as a statement. A little way off, a tree held a ring of holes. He would have walked past if his body hadn't slowed itself. The holes were arranged too neatly to be accident. The arrangement gave him the soft alarm he'd have felt once opening a drawer in a stranger S house and seeing everything lined up with a ruler. The holes were the size of the end of a cigarette. Sap stood at one like a tear that would not fall. The wood around the holes had dried darker than the rest, an old bruise. He lifted his hand and then lowered it. He knew not to touch what meant something in a place that was not his. He listened. The tap, if it could be said to come from anywhere, came from ahead and up. There is a kind of presence the body knows from before words, the approach of a weather change, a person watching from a distance, the way rooms hesitated before his father came home. Evan felt the trees grow different in their silence. He felt the tap move closer, as if he would turn and find someone behind him tapping the corner of his shoulder. He kept walking because there wasn't a rule saying he had to stop. He kept walking until the ground rose to a little ledge, and above the ledge stood a dead tree with its bark peeled away in a tall strip. The bird was there. This told him it had been always there, that the place in his head had been a map, and now the map matched the ground. The bird clung to the dead strip, its feet a mechanism. Its head was twisted in a way no live thing's head should be. Neck turned so that the beak struck the trunk at a slight angle, and still it tapped. The sound was smaller than he had thought, like a small metal spoon at the bottom of a jar. He felt, at the sight of it, a curious relief, a narrowing of the question to fit inside a shape. He stood and watched and said nothing. He had prepared to feel fear and found something else. He felt implicated. The bird's eye was wrong, or rather, its wrongness was the wrongness of a clock whose face has been replaced with another face. Seeing went into the eye as if down a well. If the well had any bottom, it was not the bottom he expected. He thought stupidly that someone had painted the eye on, as if this were a prop used to teach children what happens when you walk into closed places you don't understand. The beak came back and touched and came back and touched, and though he knew the head was broken, he could not pretend the motion was random. The angle made a diagonal drill of bright points. He did not count them out loud. He felt the alter of his breath, and he held it and then released it and then held it again, as if trying to match a tempo. He thought of reaching out. He thought of calling someone. He stood. He considered the ways in which a broken thing can bring other things into alignment, the way a bent speaker cord can make both channels return only when you bend it harder. He thought, with the practical part of himself, that the bird needed to be put out of whatever this was. He thought of the blunt mercy of stomping it. He did not move. The idea of doing that felt like slapping a hand put up in a gesture you did not understand. The pain began as a pressure. It came from nowhere he could have pointed to on a chart. It was located cruelly precise under the ledge of bone at his right temple, and then deeper behind the eye, and then deeper still, back where he felt headaches when he was young and someone had played a radio in the next room all night. It was not pain so much as instruction. For a second he felt a thought form: I will break, and what will be left will keep time. He put his hand on the tree to steady himself and felt in his palm the tremor of the tap traveling through wood. He took his hand away. His fingers felt wet, though he didn't see wetness. He tasted metal, which he told himself was a memory of working on the fence with wire and not a taste rising from inside his head. The tapping did not stop. He had the sense it would never stop, not even if the tree fell and the ground swallowed it. It had become part of the place, and the place had its rules, and the rules did not love him or hate him. He turned and walked back down the slight rise with care, his left heel sliding once on a patch of damp stone the way he knew it would. He did not remember deciding to run. He remembered the sensation of the world smearing at the edges, and the thought he had in the mid-sprint that if he fell, he would not get back up clean. He came to the backfield and crossed it, and stepped into the rectangle of his yard with its fence and its idea of order, and the hose looped in a shape on the ground like a discarded letter. He went to the sink and let the water run until it cleared, and cupped the water in his hands and pressed it to his face. He stood bent there, breathing water, and heard it through the pipes, and heard it through the bones of the house, and heard it through the bones of himself. A tap that had found a path. A day passed without shape. He moved through it by habit, showing up at the market, breaking down boxes, counting till, answering the questions of people who wanted to know whether milk went bad faster during a power outage than when power held steady. A man asked him if the fish smelled right to him, and held the styrofoam tray so close Evan could feel the plastic touch his sleeve. He said yes, because the fish smelled like fish, when fish smells like less than it might someday. Whit sketched something on his clipboard. Whit pulled Evan aside and asked if everything was okay at home, in the tone used by men who do not want to know if the answer is no. Evan said, "I'm fine," and heard the words make a tap as they left him. At night, he could not keep his fingers still. They wanted a surface. He found himself drumming, the pad of his index finger, the nail, the knuckle, and then pulled his hand away as if from a stove. He put his hands under his thighs to sit on them. He tucked his hands into his armpits. He never knew when they would begin. At the sink, his left ring finger tapped once on the edge of the basin as if to test the ceramic for a flaw. He leaned forward and put his forehead against the cabinet door. His skin warmed the wood, and the wood warmed his skin. And in that press, something like an understanding formed that felt too simple to be safe, that there were more than one way to peck. A sound came from the ceiling that might have been a squirrel or might have been a change in temperature. He braced himself for the way his head would receive it. It came as a small ripple through his vision and then settled. For half a second, everything aligned. The faucet drip, the compressors start, the porch step giving its nightly complaint, and he felt a sweet, blank calm, like the memory of using his mother's body as a pillow when he was a child, that place between her clavicle and shoulder where a heat lived that he trusted would not go out. He stood straight, and the world fell out of that alignment again. The tapping in his head was back before he reached for aspirin. He brought the memo from the table and read it under the kitchen light. He did not know why he was reading it again. He moved his finger under the words to ferry them safely to the other side. He noticed, between the lines, the pattern of his own breath on the page. A moth hit the light shade and fell to the counter, then rose and did it again. He imagined the county volunteer teams moving through the woods with radios, and he imagined one of them looking up at the dead tree and deciding in a few seconds what category to put the bird into. He thought, suddenly and wildly, that if he took the bird down, the tapping would stop, as if solving the last problem solved all of them. He turned out the light and stood in the dark with this thought. He stood there long enough that the dark changed its shape and allowed him back in. The next day, the town did what towns do. It adapted its superstitions to the day's weather and waited. School truncated to half days. A post on the store's bulletin board advertised a flashlight that won Tiglair wildlife. The bank sign, which always got stuck on one digit of the temperature when the weather crossed a season, blinked 8, 8, 8. Outside the pharmacy, a siren sounded far away toward the highway and died so quickly that it felt like old air being spilled rather than new help going out. Evan bagged flour and sugar again. He restocked paper towels. He realized at 4:10 that he had not eaten since morning and that he did not want to. He drank water until he felt it sit in his belly like a small, obedient pond. On his way home, he stopped at the light in town and watched no one cross. The red held and held. He could feel the pressure of his foot on the brake, as if his foot were not his, but a device attached. When it went green, he drove forward. Because the body has learned responses, it obeys even after everything else is rearranged. He turned onto his road, and he did not look toward the dark of the trees as he passed, though they were the first thing he had learned to look at here. He drove into his drive and killed the engine, and sat in the sudden absence the way you sit in an empty church, wondering if anyone is there. The taps resumed the instant he turned the key. This was not magic. It was simply the fact that in the absence of the engine, the smaller noises could be heard again. He laughed once, and the laugh hurt. He went inside and got a towel and wet it and wiped the counter in circles, as if he were shining a table in a diner at a job he used to do. He ran his finger along the seam where the counter met the wall and felt the strand of grit that always lived there. He put his palm flat on the table and felt the pulse in the heel of his hand, and then felt the slight but decisive lift of his second and third fingers, as if they were searching for a rhythm the table could give back. He closed his fist, He did not close it with anger. He closed it the way a person closes their eyes before stepping into a shower. He did not go back into the woods that night or the next. He let the thought of going back live as if on a leash. It came when he washed a fork, or when the neighbor's dog barked, or when the washing machine in the next apartment hit its spin and bucked and then settled down. He knew that when he went back, he would not do the thing he imagined doing, that he was not a man who hit animals with the hard blank of himself, even when such hitting was called compassion by others. He knew he was a man who could stand and look for a long time at something broken and then go home and look at the places that now resembled it. He found himself moving through the market with a tendency to pause by the display where small mechanical timers shaped like eggs and mushrooms were arranged. He twisted one once out of curiosity, and it ticked in a way that hurt his throat, and he put it back quickly. He avoided the blood pressure machine. He avoided the aisle with the canning jars because the ring of them when people put them back wrong made a sound like glass teaching itself to break. He wiped without being asked. He twice opened the door for a woman pushing a double stroller without being aware he planned to do that. His hands wanted to be useful. In town, a man on the radio said words like vector and mortality event, but not with the hard brightness of expertise, more the way a substitute teacher tries out terms to see how they feel in a room. He said the lab was checking the birds for signs of something new. He said they had reason to doubt the presence of any immediate danger to people and pets. He said caution like a word learned yesterday. He said it was okay to be nervous, that anxiety is a function, not a failing. Evan thought, my anxiety is functioning. He bought a battery radio for himself and then didn't unbox it because he realized the radio wouldn't tell him anything he did not already suspect about the backyard. The thing in his head became easier to ignore during bright afternoons and impossible at 3 in the morning when the house settled and every settling was a syllable. He noticed that it came in periods of more and less rather than only more. He noticed that when he stood perfectly still and breathed shallow, it sometimes lightened, that when he moved too quickly, it sharpened and sped. He noticed that eating salt made it step back 2 paces the way a dog can be told to. He noticed that the only thing it could be said to respond to was him. He arranged receipts on the table in a row by size. He had not done that before. He noticed that when he arranged them just so, his head gave him a breath's worth of relief, like letting an elastic waistband out one hole. He did it again with the rubber bands in the drawer, sorting them by thickness, and felt stupid and calm. He placed his mug over the smallest rubber band, as if that were part of a game he remembered from school. The mug's chip sat aimed toward the door. He did not plan that. He set the towel folded nearly square. The towel resisted being squared, so he found the grain of the fabric and spoke to it with his hands until it lay down like a dog. He went back to the woods after supper on a Monday. He took nothing with him but his hands. The light had thinned in the air that way certain evenings do, reluctant to give up, but already given up. He wore his jacket with the snag near the cuff. He had the feeling of retrieving something loaned and overdue. At the county gate, no one stood because this was not a trailhead. This was the gap in his fence where the animals had made a path and the people had pretended not to notice. He went in, shoulders drawn slightly like a man who knows a room. He found the dead tree by its wrongness among rightnesses. It had no bark where bark should be. It was grey, like an old nail. He stood at the same distance he had stood before. He told himself he was not a hero. He told himself he was not a coward. He told himself he did not know what he was and would find out by standing there. The bird was still there. Its head had been this way too long for anything in nature, yet there it was. The eye did what it did. He expected the pain to begin as it had before and prepared himself. It did. He took it, the way you take a deep breath before doing something that will cost. He stepped closer. He saw then that under the strip where the bird tapped the wood had taken the repeated blows and dutifully recorded them, as if the tree were the instrument and the bird the hand. The dots made a pattern he almost understood, and then did not. It embarrassed him to feel this, almost. It made him feel like someone moving toward an answer in a multiple-choice test who decides at the last second to change to D and lives a long time with that choice. He placed his palm to the tree again. He did it gently despite himself. The sap stuck a little, not to his skin, but to his attention. He leaned his forehead and in that place found a coolness that he had not known he wanted. He tilted his head and arranged his body so that the tapping points under the bird aligned with the skull inside his skin. He did not plan to do this. He did it the way a river finds the lower character of a word on a page. When the beak hit wood, he felt it print in him as heat, then cold. Time changed. It did the thing it does when waiting in a room becomes the room itself. He did not know how long he stood there. He did not count the taps because counting would be a way to own them, and he did not own them. He listened to his breath alternate with the sound. He reached a point where he thought very kindly that he could step back and leave, and that leaving would have no effect on whatever was working through him. He stepped back and left, and whatever was working through him kept working. On the way home, the dark had become near metal. He felt watched, but not by a person. He felt logged. A light at the edge of his neighbor S lot burned with a color that did not belong to any bulb he had bought at the hardware. He opened his fridge, because that is what you do when you do not know what else to do, and the light inside the fridge struck him as ferocious, too intent on revealing small errors, an onion sprouting green, a ring of milk around the jug's mouth. He closed it. He sat at the table with his hands in his lap. He could feel the tapping thread through him and find purchase in the places where his skull had hairline seams from a childhood fall, places long healed and long forgotten, sutures that had never been meant to be doors. He put his head down on the table and felt the table be a kind of home for what was happening. He breathed the smell of wood that had known many plates. In the days that followed, he moved with a calm he would not have predicted. He had believed there would be screaming in him, that he would run to someone and say, "Put your hand here," that he would present his body as a diagnostic object to be solved. Instead, he worked his hours and spoke when spoken to, and washed his one pot and one plate and arranged the towel. The tapping was a new weather. He did things around it the way you mow on days that are not rain. It ate hours he had used for staring at screens. He did not set an alarm because the tapping woke him before the alarm would have, and he felt grateful that he had been spared that particular sound. He did not call anyone because he did not have anyone to call in that way, not because he was unloved, but because his loves had gone to other towns in ways that did not leave numbers behind. A woman at the market told him she was having headaches too, and suggested the barometric pressure. He agreed because barometric pressure is something everyone can agree upon without lying. Wit told him a story about a woodpecker that had once poked a hole in his gutter and how he had plugged it with gum as a joke, and the bird had tried to drill the gum and had looked confused. Evan found himself smiling. He held the image in his palm and warmed it, then put it down gently on the counter because he did not have the energy to keep warming it. There were other pressures. The county extended the advisory, then they made it a closure. Then they made it a closer closure with fines attached. A chain went across the entrance to the main lot, and a notice attached to the chain said words like mandatory and violation. The notice used the passive voice where it could. Staff hours at the library shortened because the librarian had a husband who was not sleeping. Wit drew a schedule for the week that had holes in it, and the holes were named after the people who had not shown up. The church bell stayed quiet. The streetlight on Elm gave up and stayed dark, and a temporary stop sign appeared at the intersection with that light, which was a sheet of metal on a stick stuck into a rubber tire filled with concrete. Someone tilted it the correct way each morning at 7 nuts as an act of care. Evan's sleep shrank to a shape that could not be folded or spread. He slept on the couch because the couch held him like a ditch. He dreamt of nails, not going in, but waiting at the edge of going. He woke with his jaw clamped around a nothing he had not wanted. He put his hand on the back of his head and felt heat there. He went into the bathroom, and the mirror told him what people look like when they are listening to something no one else hears and trying to be polite about it. He did not go to work one morning because he knew that if he went, he would say something to a customer he could not take back. He called Whit and said, "I think I've got something." Whit said, "The stomach?" And Evan said yes, though it was a lie. Whit said, "Feel better," in the tone you use to tell someone to pay their water bill. For a day, he walked from room to room with a towel over his shoulders, like a man who had left the shower too early. He looked out the window at the woods. He did not go into the woods. He rubbed his forehead and felt, beneath the skin, a tenderness as if a bruise were forming, as if something wanted space, and the bones needed to be polite to it, and weren't to being. He put his head on the cool window glass. The tapping continued as if it were a thing you could hang a coat on. He picked up his mug and found his knuckle tapping the handle once, twice, unbidden, and it felt like someone else had taken his hand and used it for a demonstration. He set the mug down hard enough to make a sound, and the sound satisfied something in him. When he did go into the woods again, it was because he could not stand being the person who wanted to go into the woods, and then didn't he? He followed the path he had made with his body through the break in the fence, and he followed the path his mind had made the moment this began. He wore the jacket again. He wore the boots. He took with him a cord and a rag, and a notion not to do anything with them. He walked slowly. The tap moved ahead of him like a hand beckoning. He would say later, if anyone ever asked, and no one ever would, that the place felt like a room in which someone had been walking around for a long time and had left a line in the carpet. The bird's head had not healed because healing was not what this was. It pecked and pecked. He could not stand to watch in the way he had before, because now the taps seemed to pull something out of him each time they struck the wood, as if a wire had been run from the trunk to behind his eye, and each strike tugged the wire another inch. He approached until the bark's rag edges were at his hand. He said out loud, "I'm sorry," which surprised him because he had not been thinking of saying anything. He took his rag as if to rid the wood of sap or blood or whatever the tree had exhaled. Then he let the rag fall. He tied the cord around the trunk in a way that would not impede the bird, and then he untied it because the knot made him aware of what he was doing, as if someone were watching. He held his hands up, palms out, as if confronted by a person with a need. He put his head gently against the trunk. He would not say forever, but he allowed something to enter him. There is not a precise language for this in the town where he grew up or here. He would have called it resignation if resignation did not sound like quitting, and if quitting did not sound like failure. He called it standing, as if the word could be stretched to mean more than standing. The taps became the object, and the rest of the world made itself furniture around the object. His skull agreed to be a room where the sound could live. He slept that night in a way that included no dreams he could keep. He woke with the tapping in place, more constant now, like a technology that had been made compatible. He washed the mug and towel and stood the towel in a tight fold, and let the hose run a while, and then shut it off and felt each action answered. He moved through the house like someone who has learned to live with an engine running under the floor. The radio on the counter, still unboxed, looked like something for a new world that would not arrive. People honked less at the light that got stuck on red. People drove the long way around rather than past the woods. A man came in for a bag of ice and told Evan he would be leaving town for a week. For no reason, and Evan nodded. A woman coughed in line, and 3 people pivoted as one. The county volunteers with radios could be seen at the edge of the forest, like extra punctuation marks. A notice appeared on the library door that said, "Quiet, please," in larger letters than before. The bishop from a town over sent a letter to the pastor at the church that reminded the flock to turn their fear into prayer. And the pastor, who had known fear in a different place where radio static meant incoming shelling, put the letter in the top drawer of his desk and closed it and walked home to sit with his wife, who was teaching a baby to hold its head up. The world continued. It changed shape according to pressures it could not help. Evan was careful not to speak much in case his words broke into taps. He answered questions with nods and short phrases. He smiled because people needed the smile as proof something was still possible. He ate one slice of bread with butter at night and felt that to be sufficient because the idea of more made him want to make less. He lay at intervals in the bath because the water excess weight on his ears brought a different quiet, not silence, but a thickening. He put his head under and his chest rose and fell like a boat tied to a dock. He told himself as he lay back that this would pass, or if not pass, change to something he could hold without staring. He felt tenderness toward his own skull. He avoided mirrors because the man in them watched him with too much energy. He caught his reflection once in a window and felt a silly thought that he had grown thin in a way that made him look like someone recovering from something. He did not measure himself. He cut his hair in the bathroom with scissors and did a bad job and then did not fix it. He wore his hat to work. Whit did not say anything about the hair, and Evan liked Whit for that at least. He liked Whit for appearing to believe that men's private things were larger and more fragile than could be addressed in a grocery store. He liked Whit for saying, "You okay?" in a way that meant both, "Please do the schedule," and "I know about holes." He wondered gently if the town would be changed by this in a way that would show later. If a generation hence there would be people who stood a certain way when listening, one shoulder slightly cocked because their mothers had slept lightly in September. He wondered if children would draw trees as if they had doors. He wondered if the story of Loudon would include the month when the birds did this, and then the part that followed, when people began to tap on their own skulls, when thinking without knowing why. He wondered if anyone in town would place their forehead against a piece of wood in their house when they needed calm, and if they would say it was because their fathers had done it, and that their fathers had done it because their fathers had been boys here in this specific weather when the county posted signs. The radio, when he turned it on at last, on a Thursday night when the sky looked made of wet cotton, told him the state lab could not find anything novel. It said the word toxin with a shrug inside. It said samples were being sent to a university 2 states over, but did not say which, because it had been asked not to print that. It said irregularities. It said concerns about migratory patterns. It said the word collective action twice in 1 hour, once about this, once about a different thing. He listened and felt no change in the tapping. He turned it off and set it back where it had been and went to bed and got up and went back to the kitchen and opened the fridge and closed it again without removing anything. He knew he had lost something that week, and he was old enough to recognize the shape of loss without needing to name what had been taken. He had lost ease, yes, and a phase of appetite. He had lost the sense that his edges belonged to him alone. He had lost time to the patience of small noise, which is not nothing. He had gained what people do not speak of in newspapers, a containing of a thing in himself that would have to be carried, and he would carry it the way men carry the predictions of their fathers or the tendency to return to the same street on the walk home. On a Friday, the sky broke into fall in the space of an hour. The wind changed and moved through the trees with that scraping silk sound that always made him want to stand still. Leaves let go in ones, then threes, then a crowd. The air went colder by 10 degrees without warning. He could smell distant smoke. The tapping remained. He walked out to the edge of his yard and stood at the fence and looked at the place where the path slipped through. He would not go in that day. He would not lay his skull against the wood. He would not do any of the things he had done. He would stand at the boundary and see if that made a new shape of his waiting inside the house. He rested his hand on the fence post. He had sanded this post in the summer. It fitted him. He stood there until the sun had moved 2 fence slats worth. He listened. Behind his skull, the taps continued in a measure that felt like breathing in a different room. He said aloud to the fence or to the air, "Okay," and felt the word put down like a tool in a place where it will be needed later. There were days after that felt almost ordinary. He would choose the word almost and be content to let it carry more than it seemed to. He worked. He took home his receipt and put it in the drawer and forgot it or remembered it. He nodded at the man who sold bait in the shop next door and whose fingers were permanently nicked. He noticed he had become the person people asked, "You hear it?" And he learned to answer in a way that allowed the person to say whatever they needed to say next. He avoided talking about the eye. He avoided saying the word curse because he did not believe in the blessing that would need to exist for the curse to be its opposite. He watched the woman with the double stroller unfold a blanket for her babies in the park and saw her pause, a hand to her temple, and then go on. And he thought tenderly, "You will be fine not believing it and believing it enough for the minute to move." He watched a dog tilt its head with serious concentration. He watched a man in a neon vest sweeping leaves in front of the post office and imagined the broom's bristles, talking to the pavement in syllables the broom understood. He watched a teenage boy stand with his bicycle at the closed gate to the trail and think hard about it, and then turn and pedal back the way he'd come, and Evan wanted to clap. Snow would come and lay quiet on the woods and swallow sound, and then would come a wind that made small ice rings fall from limbs and ping the hood of his truck like scattered pennies. The tapping would travel through that as it had traveled through warm. In time, Loudon would open its gates again one at a time. The county would say the event was over. The paper would say a version of "not as bad as we feared" and a version of "worse" in how it altered us. The church would change the sandwich board to announce a potluck. The boy at the deli would leave for an inland city and text photos of winter there, which was more like an idea and less like a weather. Evan would find the towel had softened with washing and time, and that the square he could make of it was now a little truer. On a calm morning months after, he would walk again to the dead tree and find it fallen and damp at the seam where it had rotted. And he would kneel and press his hand to the soft place and feel not a tapping, but something like a memory of pressure in his palm, as if someone had squeezed his hand beneath the skin. He would look for the bird without believing it would be there. He would not see it, because the woods have ways of taking back small machinery. He would feel the tapping in his skull, smaller now, steadier, folded down to a metronome that marked precisely nothing he could assign on paper. He would stand. He would say nothing at all. He would go home. For now he stood in his kitchen in Loudon, while outside the woodpecker tapped in a measure he no longer could pretend was entirely elsewhere. He rinsed his mug with hose water that smelled like iron and yellow leaves. He dried it with a softened towel. He turned the mug's chip toward the window. He sat at the table and laid his hands flat on the wood, and in the minute before his fingers began to move, he permitted himself to be still, to feel everything that was in him and outside of him, arranged by a rhythm not his, and to accept that not all arrangements are punishments. He waited. His fingertip rose and tapped very lightly once, and then again, and the room held it like breath. He looked at the circle left by the mug's wet bottom. It faded as he watched, but not all the way. He did not make a sound. The fridge exhaled and clicked, and then the compressor woke with a hum that he now heard as a friendly thing. The traffic light 3 roads away did whatever it wanted to do. The woods kept their rules. He swallowed, and it was the loudest sound in the room. He tapped again, gentler than before, and stopped and lowered his hand, and knew in the way one knows about years that the sound would be there to greet him when he picked it up. He sat with it, he breathed. He let it count what it was counting, without asking the number out loud. He did not go to the window to look. The town made its small, continuous noises, and the day shifted over him in a way that was not unkind.